Good evening, sleepy historians. What's the Arctic equivalent of losing your car keys? Realizing your kayak floated away because you used frozen squid as an anchor. Tonight's historical roast covers all the ways early hunters messed up, from confusing icebergs for landmarks to accidentally proposing to seals. If you enjoy drifting off to strange little history lessons, hit subscribe. No pressure. Just if you like this sort of thing. Let me know in the comments if you've ever tried kayaking, or if you'd rather stay warm and dry. Now, dim the lights, plug in your heated blanket, and let's ease into the story of the Arctic's most essential mistake-proofing DIY project. The hunter's kayak. Building a kayak in the Arctic wasn't just difficult. It was like trying to assemble IKEA furniture while wearing oven mitts. Except failure meant drowning in freezing water. Hunters started their boat-making process during the coldest months, when every breath hung visible in the air and touching metal tools with bare hands could leave your skin behind. Picture searching for driftwood along windswept shores where the ice could shift suddenly, swallowing promising timber without warning. Wood was so scarce that builders became forensic investigators of sorts, examining each battered log. They searched for specific qualities straight-grained spruce if they were lucky, because it split cleanly. Birch worked in a pinch, but warped unpredictably. Sometimes they'd find valuable fragments from Siberian forests carried across by ocean. Currents, though these prizes often came with wave-smoothed edges that ruined structural integrity. When good wood ran out entirely, they'd cannibalize old sled parts or scavenge wreckage from failed hunting trips. The gathering process followed strict seasonal rhythms. Spring tides after the ice breakup brought fresh driftwood deposits, while summer storms could deliver unexpected bounty if you got there before neighboring groups. By autumn, all usable timber had usually been collected, stripped, and stored under rocks to prevent warping. Come winter, hunters conducted careful inventories before selecting pieces for frames, judging each piece's potential by running calloused fingers along the grain. Failure to gather enough materials meant either abandoning the build or trying. Desperate improvisations. Some stretched walrus intestine over whalebone frames, creating unstable but buoyant craft. Others lashed together oddly shaped scraps into asymmetrical skeletons that required constant balancing while paddling. These jury-rigged solutions often meant the difference between eating seal meat that winter or merely smelling it on the fires. Of luckier hunters nearby, smart builders always collected extra materials for inevitable repairs. A single storm could demolish months of work, reducing a kayak frame to splinters against the rocks. Teams guarded their wood caches jealously, sometimes disguising them beneath mounds of harmless-looking stones. Occasionally, they'd plant false markers to mislead rival hunters' early Arctic espionage conducted with driftwood as the prize. The preparation extended beyond mere collection. Builders cured their wood slowly near smokeless fires, turning logs, while singing to them, not from superstition, but to ensure even drying. Green wood meant warping. Overly dry wood became brittle. Each piece had to reach that perfect midpoint where it would flex under strain but never break. They tested strips by bending them against their knees, listening for telltale creaks or cracks in the silence of snow-blanketed camps. Seasoned builders could estimate a log's suitability just by its smell when split fresh resin signaled flexible strength, while fermented odors warned of hidden rot. Some chewed tiny portions to judge moisture content, though this diagnostic method occasionally resulted in accidentally consuming valuable materials during lean times. More than one promising kayak frame fell victim to midnight cravings when winter rations ran low. The real challenge came when usable wood simply couldn't be found. That's when hunters turned to the most improbable substitutions. Whale vertebrae became seat supports, narrow tusks transformed into reinforcement ribs, and in extreme cases, entire frames got built from lashed-together antlers. These patchwork creations required constant maintenance, but proved that necessity doesn't just invent. It improvises wildly with whatever's at hand. Eventually, all this gathering and preparation led to that first crucial cut into the chosen wood. One bad stroke here could ruin months of waiting. Builders angled their stone blades carefully, following natural fissures in the material. The sound of a clean split carried further across the frozen landscape than you might expect. Sharp retort that drew approving nods from nearby craftsmen and envious glances from less prepared groups. But splitting the wood was just the first step toward an even trickier phase. Building a kayak frame wasn't about tying sticks together. It was more like solving a geometry problem, where the angles had to survive crashing waves and crushing ice. Builders worked from memory, reciting measurements passed down through generations while their hands shaped the wood. They knew that being off by even a finger's width could make the difference between a kayak that rode the waves and one that flipped the moment you leaned left. Every piece had its place. The longest beam ran down the center as the spine, curved slightly upward at each end. Ribs arched up from this backbone at precise intervals, spaced close enough to support the skin, but far enough apart to keep the kayak light. Builders tested each rib's curve by pressing it against their chest. If it flexed too easily, it went back near the fire for more drying. Too stiff, and they'd shave off thin layers until it bent without snapping. Lashing the pieces together required more than simple knots. They used split sinew from caribou legs, soaked until it became pliable, then wrapped in intricate patterns around each joint. These wraps allowed controlled movement, enough flex for waves to ripple through the frame without coming apart. Some builders reinforced key joints with pegs carved from walrus tusk, wedged in so tight they'd only loosen when submerged in freezing water, which swelled the wood just enough to hold everything firm. Testing the frame happened in stages. First, builders would lift it overhead and shake it hard, listening for any telltale rattles that meant loose lashings. Next came the bend test, placing heavy stones along the length to simulate a hunter's weight while checking for excess flex. The best frames dipped slightly under pressure, but sprang back the moment weight lifted. A bad frame sagged like a tired dog, or worse, cracked with a sound like ice splitting underfoot. The most critical measurement was the kayak's sheer the ree, upward curve at bow and stern. Too steep, and the kayak would plow through waves awkwardly, exhausting the paddler. Too flat, and swells would constantly wash over the deck. Builders judged this by sighting along the frame while crouching at water level, imagining how it would meet the horizon. Sometimes they'd place the unfinished frame in shallow water, watching how it rode small ripples before committing to a final shape. Material defects could ruin everything. Hidden cracks in wood might hold firm during assembly, but split open after days of pounding surf. Builders checked for these by tapping each piece lightly with a stone, listening for dull thuds instead of clear tones. They avoided wood with dark streak signs of rot that could spread. Knots were risky too. A badly placed one could weaken the entire rib. Some clever builders worked around flaws by repositioning pieces, turning imperfections into design features. Balance mattered as much as strength. A kayak with its frame slightly heavier on one side would constantly pull to that direction, forcing endless correction strokes. Builders checked symmetry by hanging the frame from its center line with a comb, leather thong, adjusting until it hung level. Weight distribution extended to where they placed stronger wood, extra reinforcement. Went at stress points like the cockpit rim or where harpoon lines would pull tight during hunts. The final check involved the builder lying inside the bear frame, gripping imagined paddle positions while twisting their body as if rolling. Any frame that flexed unpredictably during this test went back for adjustments. Seasoned builders could feel a frame's quality through their backs. The best ones adjusted to movement subtly, like a good boot breaking in. Bad ones resisted, or flexed too late, warning signs of potential disaster in rough conditions. Flexibility wasn't just about survival in waves. It also helped the kayak withstand impacts with ice. A rigid frame might crack when grazed by a drifting berg, while a flexible one would shudder and rebound. Builders learned this through trial and error, watching how different frames behaved when pushed against ice ledges or struck lightly with clubs during testing. The sweet spot came when wood absorbed shocks without losing its shape, like a well-strung bow bending but always returning true. Joint tightness changed with temperature. Lashings tied tight in the morning might loosen by afternoon as sinew dried, or tighten to the point of straining wood when damp. Builders compensated by checking their work at different times of day, adjusting wraps slightly to account for expected conditions when the kayak would be used. Some rubbed whale oil into critical joints to slow moisture changes, buying precious time during long hunts. The frame's strength determined how thin the skins could be. Sturdy frames allowed for lighter, more flexible coverings that improved speed. Fragile ones needed thicker hides for extra support, which weighed the kayak down. Builders made this call based on how the frame performed in tests. There was no going back once the skins went on. A well-built frame wasn't just structural, it dictated every aspect of how the finished kayak would handle out on the freezing water. Certain designs had quirks only apparent after completion. Kayaks built from spring-harvested wood tended to tighten their joints in cold water, becoming more rigid. Autumn wood frames stayed slightly flexible year-round. Builders accounted for this when choosing materials, knowing a spring-built kayak might need gentler handling until it had weathered its first season. These subtle traits made each kayak unique, something hunters learned intimately through use. When everything worked, the frame became a perfect balance, light enough to lift, yet strong enough to endure, stiff where needed, but forgiving where it counted. This skeleton determined how the kayak would move before skins ever touched it. Now came the part where that carefully built frame got wrapped in something equally important: skins prepared to face the water head on. Picking the right animal skin for a kayak wasn't just about what was available. It was like choosing between freezing to death quickly or slowly. Seal skins stretched easier and dried faster, but walrus hides lasted longer against sharp ice. Hunters would examine each fresh hide like detectives at a crime scene, looking for scars, thin spots, or discoloration that might mean weakness. The best hides came from seals taken in spring, when their coats were at their thickest after winter. Each one had to be large enough to cover wide sections of the frame without excessive seams where water could leak through. Skin preparation started by draping the fresh hides over wooden frames to scrape off every bit of fat and membrane. Women usually handled this part, working stone scrapers across the inner surface until their arms ached. They knew leaving even a fingernail-sized patch of fat could cause rot later. Some groups soaked hides in urine to loosen stubborn tissue, an early form of tanning that made the skin more pliable. The smell drove dogs wild, so this work happened downwind from camp. Cleaned skins were then rinsed in seawater, which helped preserve them better than fresh water. Stretching the hide properly made all the difference. Too tight, and it might tear when the kayak flexed in waves. Too loose, and it would flap like wet laundry in the wind. Hunters tested give by pressing a thumb into sections of the stretched skin, checking how quickly it sprang back. Walrus skin needed more force to stretch, but held its shape better over time. Seal skins sometimes stretched unevenly, creating thin patches that required reinforcement with extra stitching or layers. Builders watched for natural stretch lines in the hide, aligning these with the kayak's stress points for maximum durability. The worst moment came when a hide tore during stretching, a sound like wet paper ripping that made everyone go quiet. Salvaging torn hides meant careful stitching with sinew thread, but these repaired sections always leaked first. Some groups kept emergency patches ready from previous year's scraps, though mismatched skins made for a kayak that handled unpredictably. A badly torn hide meant starting over, which could delay hunting season by weeks. More than one hunter had to borrow or even steal skins when failures piled up too close to winter. Communities developed tricks for identifying the best hides early. Some looked at how light passed through good skins, showed even transparency when held up to the sun. Others judged by feel, running hands along the grain to detect subtle thickness changes. Experienced preparers could predict a skin's stretch just by how it draped over their arm. Certain families became known for their eye in selecting hides, their kayaks fetching higher trade value as a result. Rival hunters sometimes tried to sneak inferior hides into these experts' caches, leading to arguments settled through public tests of the disputed materials. Seal skins had another advantage. Their hair follicles laid flat when wet, creating a smoother surface that let water roll off easily. Walrus hides tended to retain tiny ridges where bristles had been, causing more drag in the water, but standing. better to abrasion. Builders often used both types strategically seal skins for the upper sections exposed to waves and spray. Walrus for the hull where ice scraped constantly. Getting this mix wrong meant either a slow kayak or one that wore through too fast. Some hunters even used different animal skins for specific parts. The thicker hide from a bull walrus for the keel, young seal skins for the flexible deck area. Drying the prepared skins required constant attention. Too fast, and they'd shrink. Unevenly. Too slow and mildew could set in. Builders rotated the frames hourly at first, then daily as the skins tightened. Cloudy days were better, for gradual drying direct summer sun could bake hides brittle. The final product should feel like stiff leather, neither rubbery nor crackly when folded. Some builders tested dryness by blowing on sections. If their breath didn't slightly moisten the surface, it was ready. Over-dried skins needed careful oiling to restore flexibility without becoming greasy. Color patterns in the hides affected camouflage too. Piebald seals produced mottled skins that blended well with ice flows, while solid dark hides stood out against snow, but vanished in dark water. Hunters planned their kayaks' coloration based on where they'd hunt most light for ice platforms, dark for open water. Some even stitched in intentional patterns mimicking wave shadows. These choices mattered less for survival than the skin's strength, but showed how deeply hunters considered every variable. After all, swimming home because your kayak stood out too much to seals was its own kind of failure. Women often coordinated the group's skin preparation, assigning tasks based on skill-steady-handed elders, did delicate stitching, while stronger members handled the heavy stretching. The work moved in rhythm, with songs pacing the scraping and stretching motions. This communal effort ensured no single failure doomed the kayak. If someone tore a hide, others could pool reserve materials. Children learned by processing small scraps first, graduating to full hides only after years of practice. The best preparers developed an intuition for materials, knowing exactly when to stop scraping or how much tension a particular skin could take before giving way. Final inspection happened with multiple people examining each hide by firelight, where flickering shadows revealed inconsistencies missed in daylight. They'd poke potential weak spots with bone needles, seeing how much pressure it took to puncture. Any questionable sections got reinforced immediately or set aside for non-critical uses like storage bags. The approved skins were rolled tightly with protective layers of grass between folds and stored in cool, dry places until the frame was ready. Unrolling them later produced a distinct creaking noise, the sound of a kayak's future, skin announcing it had survived the first set of tests. Stretching skins over a kayak frame was like wrestling a greased walrus. If you stopped paying attention, everything went sideways fast. Teams worked in shifts, some pulling the hide taut with carved wooden tongs, while others stitched with bone needles the size of fishing hooks. The process started by draping the stiffened skin over the frame like a ragged blanket, then methodically working outward from the center in all directions. Each pull had to be precise. Too much force in one area created thin spots that would tear later under stress. They used simple but effective tools. Wooden stretchers shaped like oversized chopsticks, hooked into pre-punched holes along the skin's edges. Teens pulled these stretchers outward steadily, not in jerks, while feeling for the skin's resistance through their grips. Bone needles attached preliminary stitches whenever the skin reached ideal tension, acting as temporary anchors until the final sewing. Experienced workers could tell by touch alone when to stop pulling, that subtle moment when the hide stopped stretching evenly and began resisting dangerously. Coordination was everything. Work parties organized themselves like a living machine, stronger members at the heavy pulling stations, those with nimble fingers handling the stitching. No one spoke much during the critical stretches. Instead, they used a system of grunts and nods developed over years of practice. The lead builder would tap a stretching tool twice to signal another inch of pull, once to hold position. Miscommunication meant wasted effort at best, ruined materials at worst. More than one promising hide tore because someone sneezed at the wrong moment. Songs helped maintain rhythm. Not cheerful tunes, but low, monotonous chants that matched the pace of work each. Verse ending just as another stretch needed completing. The words weren't important. The beat was. Some groups used drums or clappers to keep time, though most relied on the natural sounds of creaking wood and hissing sinew thread. Children learning the process would sometimes hum along off rhythm, until gently corrected by an elder's glare. Disasters happened often. A needle snapping mid-stitch could send someone tumbling backward into the snow. More seriously, a sudden tear might streak diagonally across the hide, forcing frantic repairs or total abandonment of that section. The worst was when stitching failed hours into the process, causing the skin to recoil violently like a snapped rubber band. Workers learned to stand clear of potential recoil paths, those who didn't gain bruises and cautionary nicknames like seal face. The sewing itself was a marvel of primitive engineering. They used a double stitch technique, where each puncture overlapped the last by exactly half its width, creating interlocking threads that sealed tighter when wet. Sinew for stitching came from the same animal as the hide whenever possible, ensuring matching flexibility. Stitchers moistened the thread with saliva as they worked, keeping it pliable enough to pull through without breaking. Every few inches, they'd test tension by flicking the stitches properly done. They produced a musical ping. Imperfections meant leaks. A single skipped stitch or uneven pull created weak zones where water would eventually penetrate. Teams inspected finished sections by holding them up to sunlight, watching for pinholes where light shone through suspiciously bright. Problem areas got restitched immediately with thicker thread, though everyone knew these patches would fail. First during actual use. The best builders took pride in stretches where no corrections were needed. Their sections required only a satisfied grunt before moving onward. Tension varied by location. The hull needed tighter stretching to resist waves and ice, while the deck required slightly more give for paddler movement. Builders marked transition zones with charcoal lines, signaling where pullers should ease their effort. Getting these transitions wrong created kayaks that either cramped the hunter's legs or sagged dangerously under load. Experienced workers could adjust tension mid-pull based on how the skin's grain aligned cutting across. Natural stretch lines required more care than following them. Drying after stretching presented its own challenges. The newly tensioned skins had to cure evenly without loosening or developing wrinkles. Builders erected temporary shelters to block direct wind yet allow gradual airflow, rotating the frame periodically to prevent sun-side overheating. Some rubbed the skin lightly with smooth stones during drying to encourage even contraction. Too fast and the surface cracked. Too slow and mildew set in. Perfect drying took about 3 days of constant monitoring anyone assigned this duty. Got very little sleep. The communal aspect prevented mistakes. While one team stretched, others observed from different angles, calling out whenever they spotted uneven tension developing. Elders watched for micro-tears invisible to younger eyes, calling immediate halts when necessary. Even children participated by running hot drinks to workers during marathon stretching sessions that could last from dawn until moonlight. No single person bore responsibility. The entire group succeeded or failed together. This shared burden meant extra hands were always available when someone's arms gave out mid-pull. Completion was marked quietly. No grand ceremonies, just a collective exhale as the final stitch went in. Workers would step back and examine their handiwork from all sides, poking suspicious spots one last time. Satisfied builders might allow themselves a small smile, while apprentices collapsed gratefully onto nearby rocks. The kayak now resembled its final shape, though the most critical step still remained turning this stretched skin into something truly waterproof. Waterproofing a kayak wasn't about fancy sprays or synthetic sealants. It came down to rendered blubber and elbow grease. Seal fat was the original waterproofing solution, boiled down until it became a thick, oily paste that smelled like low. Tied on a hot day, hunters collected this blubber from freshly caught seals, cutting it into chunks that would melt slowly over low fires. The rendering process took hours, with someone constantly skimming impurities off the surface while trying not to inhale too much of the acrid smoke. Done right, it produced a golden oil that would penetrate the kayak's skins completely. Done wrong, it left a greasy mess that attracted every wandering predator for miles. Applying the fat was a messy, intimate process. Workers used their bare hands to rub the warm grease into every inch of the kayak's skin, working it into the stitching and pores until their fingers ached. Some groups used flat stones to spread the fat more evenly, while others preferred brushes made from stiff animal hair. The key was to apply thin layers, too much at once, and the skins would sag under the weight before the fat could soak in. Hunters knew to pay extra attention to seams and stitch lines where water would find its way in first. They'd often apply fat from both sides, letting it seep through the needle holes to create complete seals. Testing happened immediately. Builders would pour seawater over treated sections, watching for beads forming versus water soaking in. A properly waterproofed area made droplets roll off like rain on a waxed car. Problem spots showed as dark patches where water penetrated, requiring another round of greasing. Some hunters took this further by actually launching the kayak in shallow waters, lying inside to feel for any dampness creeping through. False alarms happened. Often sweaty palms could mimic leaks until you remembered you'd been gripping the same spot nervously for 10 minutes. The best waterproofing jobs used multiple treatments over several days. After the first grease application dried, builders would scrape off the excess with smooth shells, then apply another thin layer. 3. Coats was standard, though some went up to 5 for kayaks destined for long whale hunts. Each round made the skins slightly darker and stiffer, until the kayak developed its own distinct smell, a mix of rancid fat, salt, and wood smoke that never quite washed out, no matter how much you paddled. Failure had immediate consequences. Stories circulated of hunters who'd skimped on grease to save time, only to find themselves sinking slowly miles from shore. A small leak meant constant bailing. A big one meant swimming in water cold enough to kill in minutes. Some tried patching. Leaks mid-hunt with emergency blubber stored in waterproof pouches. But this was messy work with gloves on and waves sloshing over the deck. More than one hunter returned home shivering violently, their kayaks sagging like wet paper from multiple failed patches. The fat itself attracted problems. Polar bears could smell treated kayaks from disturbing distances, leading to unwelcome encounters on the ice. Stored kayaks needed covering to keep dogs from licking off the grease, habit that ruined waterproofing and gave the dogs violent indigestion. In summer heat, excess fat could melt and drip onto hunters' legs, leaving stubborn stains on clothing that never fully washed out. But these were small prices to pay for staying dry in waters where falling in meant certain hypothermia without modern gear. Storage between uses required careful maintenance. Kayaks hung upside down to prevent cooling water from loosening the fat's grip. Before each hunting trip, hunters would rub down their kayak with another thin layer, paying special attention to areas that flexed most during paddling. Some kept small bladders of liquid fat tucked in their parkas during hunts body heat kept it pliable for emergency patches. After several seasons, a well-maintained kayak's skins became practically translucent from layers of absorbed grease, yet still shed water perfectly. Different communities had their own grease recipes. Some mixed in powdered charcoal to darken the kayak for camouflage, while others added crushed berries that supposedly repelled ice buildup. A few groups swore by fermenting the fat slightly before rendering, claiming it penetrated deeper, though this made the smell even more unbearable during application. What all methods shared was the understanding that perfect waterproofing wasn't a one-time task, but an ongoing ritual as vital as sharpening harpoons or checking seal lines. The final test came when hunters first took their kayaks into open water. Even after passing all surface checks, only waves would reveal hidden weaknesses. A perfectly greased kayak rode high, barely needing to shed water because so little stuck to it. A faulty one soon developed audible drips inside the cockpit, each one a reminder that returning home might involve bailing more than paddling. Experienced hunters could judge a kayak's treatment just by the sound waves made against its sides, the dull slap of a well-fatted hull versus the wet smack of one that needed more work. This tedious, smelly process was what stood between hunters and the icy water waiting to kill them. No shortcuts exist. It either you spent hours rubbing in seal fat properly, or you spent minutes drowning in freezing seawater. The greasiest kayaks weren't just waterproof. They became extensions of the hunters themselves, their skins flexing and shedding water like living things. Now came the real challenge, learning to move in this fragile shell without ending up upside down in water cold enough to stop your heart in minutes. A new kayak wasn't just given a name, it was matched to its hunter like a sled dog to its musher. The naming ceremony happened at dawn when the light was flat and gray, the best time to see imperfections in the kayak's form. Elders would circle the vessel, running hands along its sides while murmuring names under their breath. When the right one came, it stuck like a harpoon in blubber names like Swift Over Ice or Seal's Shadow that reflected what the kayak would become, rather than what it was. Some names referenced family history, like Grandfather's Reach, while others carried warnings like Don't Look Down. The worst names were practical jokes. Imagine paddling something called Drifts Like Duckweed during whale season. Hunters learned their kayak's personality through tedious trial runs in sheltered coves. Each kayak had quirks. Maybe it leaned slightly left when empty, or its bow dipped deeper than expected on forward strokes. Hunters would spend days practicing entries and exits, learning how much hip shift it took to correct the kayak's natural tilt. Some kayaks turned easier to one side, requiring subtle paddle adjustments. Others sat higher in the water when the hunter wore certain parkas, a detail that mattered when millimeters determined whether you stayed dry. The best hunters could feel their kayak's balance points through their thighs, sensing instability before it became dangerous. First launches followed strict protocols. Hunters would wait for calm mornings with no wind, carrying their kayaks into knee-deep water before sliding in carefully. No sudden movements, just gradual weight transfer until the kayak settled into its natural float. Some hunters brought along experienced mentors who'd toss small stones near the kayak, teaching them to absorb wave impacts without overcorrecting. Others practiced in waist-deep water first, getting comfortable with how the kayak rolled when they intentionally capsized. These sessions always ended with the kayak being rinsed thoroughly, salt water being kinder to the skins than fresh. Rejection was obvious when it happened. A kayak that didn't accept its hunter would behave unpredictably, turning sharply without cause or refusing to hold a straight line. Some hunters reported feeling like their kayak actively fought them, as if the wood remembered being part of a tree that once swayed against the wind. When this occurred, elders would intervene, sometimes swapping kayaks between hunters or performing additional rituals. In extreme cases, a rejected kayak might be stripped back to its frame and rebuilt, with different skins, as if giving it a new identity. The worst rejections ended with the kayak being repurposed as a storage rack, a humiliating demotion for something meant to hunt whales. Balance training looked ridiculous to outsiders. Hunters would kneel in their stationary kayaks for hours, rocking side to side until their calves cramped. The goal was to develop muscle memory that worked even when panic set in. Some practiced with weighted bags hung from the kayak's sides, simulating the pull of a harpooned seal. Others deliberately capsized over and over, proving to themselves they could right the kayak even with numb hands. The truly skilled could balance a kayak while keeping their hands raised, a party trick that also happened to be useful when needing to signal distant hunters without losing stability. Water reading was part of the bonding process. Hunters learned to interpret how their kayak responded to different currents, a slight shudder meaning hidden turbulence below, or an unexpected drift signaling changing tides. They'd study how wind affected the kayak differently when loaded with gear versus empty. Some kayaks were more sensitive to these cues than others, like skittish dogs reacting to distant storms. The best hunters could predict wave patterns just by how their kayak moved between swells, adjusting course before conditions turned dangerous. This sensitivity made some kayaks prized for whale hunting, where reading water could mean the difference between a full meat cache and becoming prey yourself. Spiritual maintenance happened regularly. Hunters would make small offerings to their kayak, a bit of fat smeared on the frame, or a drop of blood from their first catch rubbed into the stitching. Some whispered to their kayaks during long paddles, half prayer and half conversation. Neglecting these rituals risked the kayak's cooperation. There were stories of hunters who forgot offerings and found their kayaks suddenly sluggish or leaky. The relationship wasn't superstitious so much as practical. You took care of what kept you alive, whether it had a spirit or just needed regular greasing. Testing the partnership came gradually. After sheltered waters, hunters would venture past the first line of icebergs, then further as confidence grew. Each successful return strengthened the bond. The kayak had kept its hunter safe. The hunter had guided them both home. Soon the kayak became an extension of the hunter's body, reacting to shifts in weight before conscious thought. In perfect harmony, hunter and kayak could glide within arm's reach of a sleeping seal without causing a ripple. That silent approach wasn't just skill, it was two beings moving as one, the kayak anticipating its hunter's intentions like a good dog anticipating its owner's commands. The final test came when death lurked nearby. Facing a walrus or whale, the hunter needed absolute trust that their kayak would respond instantly to every subtle adjustment. There was no room for hesitation when a flick of a tail could shatter wood and bone alike. At these moments, the naming ritual proved its worth. A well-matched kayak didn't just carry its hunter into danger. It became the reason they returned. Now came the real work, taking this fragile partnership into waters where ice loomed like shattered glass and prey fought back with tusks and teeth. Silent movement in a kayak wasn't just about being quiet, it was about becoming part of the water itself. Paddles were shaped specifically for stealth, with narrow blades that sliced cleanly into the water rather than slapping it. Hunters would sand the edges smooth to prevent any creaking sounds from dried wood, and sometimes lined the shafts with sealskin grips that muffled hand movements. The best paddles made less noise than a fish breaking the surface to breathe. Breathing control was just as critical as paddle technique. Hunters trained to take slow, even breaths through their noses, timing each exhale with their paddle strokes. Any sudden inhale could send sounds skittering across calm water. Some practiced holding their breath for stretches while paddling, not because they needed to, but to discipline their lungs against reacting to surprises. A single uncontrolled gasp when spotting prey could ruin hours of careful approach. The water itself became a map of sounds to navigate. Ripples against ice told hunters where their paddle drips might echo. Smooth stretches revealed where even the smallest splash would travel farthest. Experienced hunters could read wave patterns. Like a written language, adjusting their route to use choppy areas where their movements would blend in. They knew approaching a seal from downwind wasn't enough sound carried differently over water than land, often bouncing unpredictably off. Ice formations. Paddle strokes followed strict rhythms. The entry started with the blade tip barely kissing the water's surface before sliding in at a shallow angle. Each pull stayed completely submerged, no dripping backwash to betray their position. Recovery. Strokes lifted the paddle sideways to shed water silently, rather than letting it fall in noisy droplets. Good hunters could make 50 consecutive strokes without producing any sound louder than their own heartbeat. Clothing choices affected stealth more than most realized. Stiff caribou hide parkas could squeak at the shoulders with each stroke, so hunters oiled the seams or wore softer seal gut parkas when stalking. Loose items got secured tightly. A bouncing harpoon rest sounded like a dinner bell to seals. Even hair mattered. Hunters with long locks often braided them tightly to prevent wind from whipping strands against their faces at critical moments. Timing was everything. The best hunters moved when seals were distracted, when waves crashed against ice, or birds squabbled nearby. They'd pause during suspicious quiet moments, sometimes floating motionless for half an hour until noise returned, to cover their movements. Approaching during light rain helped, but heavy rain made hearing returning hunting parties impossible, a trade-off that required constant judgment. Failed stealth had immediate consequences. A single errant drip from a paddle could make every seal head snap up simultaneously. Hunters who screwed up would sometimes lie flat against their kayaks, pretending to be driftwood until the seals relaxed. The worst scenarios sent entire groups of prey diving under ice where they couldn't be followed, returning to camp after. Spooking the day's potential meals meant facing silent disappointment from families expecting food. Distances deceived over water. What looked like an easy 100-yard approach might require quadruple that distance to use currents properly. Smart hunters took zigzag routes that appeared aimless, but actually used back eddies to avoid creating wake lines. They knew light affected visibility. Too approaching into the low midnight sun made kayaks nearly invisible, while midday light could reveal their shadow stretching terrifyingly ahead like a warning signal. The paddle wasn't the only tool for silent movement. Some hunters carried small, quieting sticks, short rods used to push off ice instead of paddling when extremely close to prey. Others developed specialized hooks to gently pull themselves along ice edges without splashing. These tools stayed sheathed in sealskin pockets until the final approach, where every normal paddle stroke was too risky. Learning silent techniques took brutal patience. Trainers would send apprentices to practice near hauled-out seals with stern instructions. Get within spear range, or don't come back till you do. Failed attempts meant long, hungry walks home as punishment. Successful hunters learned to move so quietly they could hear seals, breathing before the animals heard them coming, a skill that sometimes backfired when beluga whale songs suddenly erupted at deafening volumes nearby. Oddly, complete silence could be as suspicious as noise. The best hunters incorporated natural sounds into their movements, letting an occasional soft paddle drip blend with wave laps. Some even mimicked seal splashes at key moments. The goal wasn't total silence, but becoming another unremarkable part of the Arctic soundscape, just another piece of ice shifting, just another animal moving about its business. Body positioning made subtle differences. Leaning slightly forward reduced the kayak's profile against the horizon line. Holding the paddle lower prevented arm silhouettes from becoming visible. Some hunters stuffed their parkas with extra padding to alter their outlines, blurring the human shape into something less recognizable. The most extreme practitioners could curl themselves so tightly into the cockpit that distant seals mistook them for drifting debris. Currents provided free movement, if you knew how to use them. Instead of fighting cross-currents, expert hunters would angle their kayaks to let the water carry them sideways toward prey with minimal paddling. They read subtle surface textures to find these invisible rivers within the sea-smooth lanes, indicating fast water that could glide them silently into position. Using current properly meant sometimes arriving later than planned, but doing so completely unnoticed. The ultimate test came when conditions betrayed stealth. A shifting wind could suddenly carry sound straight to prey, or an unexpected ice calving might startle both hunter and quarry simultaneously. Adapting in these moments separated adequate hunters from exceptional ones, knowing when to freeze, when to retreat, or when to attack immediately before the advantage evaporated completely. Over years, these decisions became instinctual, wired into muscle memory alongside paddle strokes and harpoon throws. Silence alone wouldn't save a hunter when the kayak tipped upside down in freezing water. That required another set of brutal skills altogether. The roll wasn't just a trick. It was the difference between dinner and death. Learning to roll a kayak wasn't practice. It was preemptive survival. Arctic waters stole body heat fast enough to kill in minutes, leaving no time for hesitation when upside down. The dry suits that made rolling possible were marvels of necessity. Sealskin with bone toggles at wrists and neck, whale intestine layered underneath, all stitched with sinew thread that swelled when wet to seal out water. Hunters greased the seams with seal fat weekly, testing them by crouching in shallows to check for leaks before venturing further. A good suit lets you work in freezing water for 10 minutes. A bad one might as well be cheesecloth. Practice happened in protected coves during summer when the water was merely cold instead of deadly. Trainers would flip novice kayakers repeatedly, shouting corrections through each failed attempt. The rollout sequence burned into muscle memory. Hips snap to start momentum, paddle sweep to complete the rotation, head always last to break surface. Some tied rocks to their waists to simulate the drag of hunting gear, because a perfect roll with no load meant nothing when you're wearing 20 pounds of seal meat. Sessions ended when lips turned blue, regardless of progress. Hypothermia taught no lessons except don't get hypothermia. The real skill wasn't performing the role, but doing it before panic set in. In training, hunters practiced holding their breath upside down, counting slowly, while blindfolded to simulate murky water. They learned to distinguish seal bites from ice bumps by touch alone, because flinching at false threats wasted precious oxygen. Some sewed small pebbles into their mittens. If you could still feel the stone's edges while submerged, you weren't shaking too badly to function. The goal was to make the roll automatic, something your body did while your mind was still processing, "Oh bleep, I'm upside down." Dry land drills reinforced the motions. Hunters would lie across logs, practicing the hip flick needed to right the kayak without relying on paddle strokes. Others balanced on rounded stones to simulate instability after a successful roll. Number. Part of the movement could depend on strength-frozen fingers, might lack the grip to pull a paddle properly, and exhaustion made brute force unreliable. Everything came down to precise weight shifts and angles, techniques that worked even when your hands were numb clubs. Failure had immediate consequences. Miss the roll, and you were swimming in a freezing ocean, wearing what amounted to a leather sack. Early dry suits often ripped at the shoulders during frantic climbs back into kayaks, flooding the suit with water that stole body heat twice as fast. Hunters carried emergency bone hooks to drag themselves onto ice floes, but these snapped easily when jammed into thin ice. The unlucky ones had to swim for shore, knowing full well they wouldn't make it, their strokes slowing as their muscles locked up. Aging hunters had it worse. Older joints couldn't always execute the sharp motions needed for rolling, so many switched to wider, more stable kayaks that were harder to capsize, but couldn't chase quick prey. Some took young partners specifically to handle the rolling duties, a trade of mentoring for physical backup. Stories circulated of elders who'd refused to retire until they failed a roll 3 times, a system that sounded noble until you realized the third failure was usually fatal. Equipment failures created special nightmares. Paddle blades sometimes snapped mid-roll, leaving hunters scrambling to right the kayak with just their hands. Sealskin dry suits developed slow leaks around stress points that only appeared during prolonged immersion, and nothing prepared you for the moment when both your gloves slipped off during the roll, leaving bare hands to grasp freezing metal harpoons on the next hunting attempt. Smart hunters practiced emergency rolls, one-handed, two-handed, even using just their hips any variation that might save them when gear betrayed them. Children's training started with floating on their backs. Before they ever touched a kayak, they learned to control breathing in cold water, to orient themselves without sight, to conserve heat by curling into tight balls. Their first rolls happened in shallow ponds using tiny kayaks barely big enough to hold them. Parents watched these sessions with frightening calm. If your child couldn't master the roll, they'd never survive adulthood anyway. Those who struggled received extra practice, not coddling. The Arctic didn't offer second chances to the underprepared. Whale hunts provided the ultimate test. A panicked roll near a sounding whale could put you directly under several tons of angry blubber. On its way down, Experienced hunters knew to roll away from the whale's path, using the massive weight to help right themselves. Others timed their rolls between the whale's exhalations, when the spray would hide their movements. Getting it wrong meant either drowning or being crushed, making whale hunts the final exam for any serious kayaker. The aftermath of a successful roll was its own challenge. Coming up gasping in freezing air could trigger coughing fits that led to vomiting. A death sentence if you capsized again while weakened. Hunters trained to take slow, controlled breaths post-roll, no matter how much their bodies demanded otherwise. Some carried dried seal meat to chew afterward, forcing their jaws to work and prove they hadn't lost too much coordination. The best could roll, recover, and throw a harpoon within 30 seconds, as if nothing had happened. Worst were the times when rolling didn't matter. Maybe you'd hit your head during the capsize, or the kayak itself had broken apart on ice. Then it came down to how well your drisuit floated, whether your emergency hook caught something solid, if anyone was close enough to hear your whistles. These were the moments that separated lucky hunters from skilled ones, because sometimes luck was the only skill that counted. Survivors never spoke much about such episodes. It was bad form to dwell on moments when the sea almost won. Modern kayakers call it the Eskimo roll, like it's a trick. Arctic hunters called it breathing, because that's what you did right after, if you did it right. Now came the real measure of a hunter, chasing prey that could smash your fragile craft with a flick of its tail. Whale hunting from a kayak meant staring down an animal that could flip your entire world with one lazy flick of its tail. Picture kneeling in a skin boat, barely longer than your outstretched arms, paddling towards something the size of your house that breathes like a runaway steam engine. The first trick was getting close without becoming a speed bump. Hunters would approach from the whale's blind spot near its flank, timing their strokes to match the creature's exhales. A loud whoosh of air and spray covered a multitude of small splashes. The real weapon wasn't the harpoon itself, but the floats trailing behind it. Each harpoon head had backward-facing barbs carved from walrus tusk that lodged deep in blubber. Attached lines led to inflated sealskins that acted like underwater parachutes, dragging against the whale's movement. One float just annoyed a whale. 3 or 4 would exhaust it over hours. Hunters learned to judge float sizes carefully. Too small, and the whale wouldn't tire. Too large, and it might dive deep enough to crush them with pressure. Teamwork made the difference between eating whale and being whale poop. While one kayak moved in for the strike, others fanned out to intercept potential escape routes. The lead hunter had about 3 seconds after his harpoon hit to back paddle furiously before the whale reacted. That's when the second kayak would dart in to attach additional floats. Junior hunters stayed further back, ready to replace anyone who got capsized or to paddle fresh supplies to the front lines. Everyone knew their role like actors in a deadly play where missed cues meant broken bones. Stamina separated survivors from casualties. A single chase could last from dawn until the next low tide, with hunters taking turns leading the pursuit while others conserved energy. They carried nothing but a few strips of dried meat and a bladder of water eating Too much made you sluggish. Drinking too little gave you cramps. Some kept spare harpoon heads tucked in their parkas, the sharp points poking their chests to remind them stay alert. Woe to the hunter who needed to pee during the chase. You either held it or lost your place. In the formation, whales fought dirty when cornered. A common tactic was sudden dives that yanked attached floats underwater, creating unpredictable suction currents. Smart hunters kept their paddles ready to push off the whale's side if it surfaced underneath them. The real danger came when a whale turned to face its attackers. That's when those massive jaws opened wide enough to swallow a kayak whole. Legend spoke of hunters caught between a whale's teeth and spat out, their kayaks crushed, but their bodies miraculously intact. Nobody ever verified these stories for good reason. Harpoon lines required constant management. A loose coil could snag your paddle or wrap around your waist for a quick trip to the seafloor. Hunters used rounded bone rings to guide the lines cleanly over the kayak's side. When a whale sounded deep, they'd let line run out through their mittened hands, the friction heating the leather enough to leave blisters. Let go too fast, and you lost the whale. Hold too tight, and you'd flip. Some kept spare coils looped around their shoulders, though this came with the minor drawback of potentially strangling yourself during chaotic moments. Weather changes turned difficult hunts into nightmares. Fog could separate kayaks within minutes, leaving solo hunters attached to angry whales with no backup. Sudden winds might blow floats off course, making the whale's position impossible to track. Icebergs drifting into the hunt area created obstacles that whales used to their advantage, rubbing lines against sharp edges to sever them. Veteran hunters could read the sky well enough to call off doomed chases early, but pride or hunger sometimes overruled common sense. The kill required precise coordination. Once the whale tired, hunters would close in with long lances aimed at vital organs. Behind the flipper. This was no Hollywood stab. It took multiple strikes from different angles to reach anything fatal. The whale's death throes were their most dangerous moments, with flukes smashing water into walls that could flip kayaks 50 feet away. Everyone had to hit their marks perfectly while dodging the equivalent of several grand pianos being dropped from a rooftop. Success meant the real work began. Butchering a whale at sea required balancing on floating blubber slabs while slicing carefully. To avoid puncturing the stomach, every piece had to be secured to kayaks or towed on improvised rafts before sharks and orcas arrived. A journey home with a heavy load turned kayaks into wallowing barges that shipped water with every wave. Many a victorious hunting party drowned within sight of shore because they got greedy with their portions. Village welcoming committees had sharp eyes. They'd count kayaks leaving and returning, noting who was missing before celebrations started. Successful hunters didn't boast. They handed choice cuts to elders first, then distributed meat according to family sizes. Nothing was wasted. Even the blood got mixed with snow as emergency rations. Children would press their ears to the whales. Bones, listening for echoes of the sea, as elders told exaggerated versions of the hunt around blubber lamps. These hunts weren't just about food. They were live-or-die exams, where failure meant empty stomachs and success fed generations. Every whale taken reinforced why kayaks had to be perfectly built, why rolls had to be second nature, why silence mattered more than speed. Modern anglers complain about the one that got away. These hunters couldn't afford that luxury. Now came the ultimate test of all their preparation facing storms that didn't just want their catch, but wanted them too. A storm in the Arctic doesn't build, it attacks. One minute you're paddling in calm water, the next you're staring at waves taller than your kayak is long. The first warning usually came from the birds. Hunters watched gulls suddenly flying, inland or diving into sheltered coves. Seals would vanish from their ice floes. Then the water itself changed, small ripples forming patterns too organized to be random, like nature drawing lines where the punches would land. Wind direction told you what was coming. A shift from northwest to southwest meant warm air colliding with cold trouble. Hunters smelled storms before seeing them, a metallic tong in the air as pressure dropped. They checked wave intervals. Too long, even swells meant distant winds, while short, choppy waves signaled nearby danger. The smart ones turned home at the first sign of either. The stubborn ones often turned into lessons for future hunters. Ballast techniques kept kayaks upright when waves tried to flip them. Hunters stashed stones in the bow and stern to lower the center of gravity. Too much weight made the kayak sluggish. Too little left it unstable. Some filled bladders with seawater, letting them slosh slightly to counteract wave motions. Others tied small drag anchors made of bone and leather that slowed their drift without stopping it completely. Everything was adjustable. Add weight when facing broadside waves. Remove it when paddling with the wind. Navigating required reading water like a map. Hunters looked for lanes between wave crests where the troughs ran deepest. They timed there, paddling to surge forward with each wave's momentum, then turn sharply to avoid cresting breakers. The trick was staying perpendicular to oncoming waves. A slight angle meant certain capsizing. Some kept pieces of feather or grass tied to their kayaks to judge wind shifts instantly. Others spat into the water to check current directions when visibility dropped. Mental focus decided who survived. Panic used up oxygen and led to stupid mistakes. Hunters trained to control their breathing, taking slow inhales through the nose and longer exhales through tightened lips. Some hummed low tunes to calm their nerve songs with rhythms matching ideal paddle strokes. Others focused on small tasks, adjusting grip, checking gear, anything to avoid staring at the towering waves around them. The best could estimate wave intervals by feel alone, their bodies syncing with the sea's movements. Getting caught unprepared was a death sentence. Stories circulated of hunters who ignored warning signs and found themselves miles from shore when storms hit. Some tried riding out the weather by lashing their kayaks to drifting ice, only to watch that ice shatter under wave impacts. Others capsized repeatedly until exhaustion took them, their dry suits finally flooding after too many failed rolls. The lucky ones washed ashore barely conscious, their kayaks reduced to splinters floating in the surf. Storm knowledge wasn't just helpful, it was generational. Elders taught young hunters to watch cloud formations at dawn and dusk. Certain colors meant certain outcomes. Greenish hues warned of fierce winds, while red skies might promise temporary calm. They learned to interpret how ice melted uneven thawing patterns signaled unstable weather ahead. Nothing was trivial. Even the way snow stuck to clothing could indicate humidity levels affecting upcoming conditions. Surviving required constant adjustments. When waves grew too tall, hunters would angle their kayaks slightly downwind, sacrificing control for stability. In freezing spray, they kept one hand free to constantly wipe their goggles blind paddling. Led straight into wave crests. Some tied themselves loosely to their kayaks with floats attached, knowing a capsized hunter might survive if the kayak didn't drift away too fast. Every piece of knowledge had been earned through tragedy at some point. The worst weren't the towering waves you saw coming. It was the rogue sets that appeared without warning. These monster waves could lift a kayak straight up before dropping it into the trough behind. Hunters learned to listen for them. A sudden quieting of nearby surf often preceded their arrival. Some practiced emergency techniques, like bracing, sideways with their paddles to absorb impacts without flipping. Others knew when to abandon paddling altogether and simply cling to their kayaks like limpets until the worst passed. Navigation became impossible in heavy storms. Hunters relied on instinct when land vanished in snowfall or fog. Some tasted. The water increasing saltiness meant they were being blown seaward. Others dove briefly underwater to listen for shorebreak sounds that might guide them. The truly desperate watched which way seabirds flew, though this gamble only worked if the birds weren't also lost. Coming ashore in the wrong place could be just as deadly as staying at sea. After surviving, hunters checked their gear meticulously. Saltwater soaking required immediate rinsing in fresh water to prevent rot. Harpoons got oiled to guard against rust. Kayak frames inspected for hidden cracks from wave impacts. Those who'd been capsized tested their rolling skills again in calm waters, confirming the ordeal hadn't damaged their technique. Everything needed to be ready quickly storms depleted food stores, making the next hunt urgent regardless of weather. The real marker of the seasoned hunter wasn't avoiding storms. It was surviving them with enough composure to paddle out again tomorrow. They'd return to villages with exaggerated tailies for the children, making light of moments that had nearly killed them. Silent nods passed between those who'd faced similar terrors. No need to recount what everyone already understood. Then they'd eat what little food remained, patch whatever gear was salvageable, and prepare to do it all again. Because in the Arctic, you either learned from the storms or became one with them. Successfully weathering a storm meant more than just survival. It proved the kayak's worth. Every piece of craftsmanship got tested under those conditions. The flexibility of the frame, the waterproofing of the skins, the balance of the ballast. A kayak that brought its hunter home safely wasn't just wood and hide anymore. It was part of the family. And like any family member, it would soon be called upon to help feed everyone else. The return feast after a successful hunt wasn't just a meal. It was a carefully orchestrated redistribution system that kept the whole village alive. Imagine piles of fresh meat and blubber being divided not by who caught it, but by who needed it most. Elders got the tenderest cuts. Families with children received extra portions, and even the dogs got scraps boiled into soup. Nothing went to waste. Even the blood was mixed with snow and frozen for later use. Each piece was counted and allocated, according to rules passed down through generations. Rules that might seem harsh to outsiders, but kept everyone alive through long winters. Preservation started immediately. Meat got sliced thin and hung on drying racks near smokeless fires that pulled moisture out without cooking it. Blubber was rendered into oil that would keep lamps burning for months. Some cuts went into underground. Ice cellars where permafrost acted as nature's freezer. The best hunters knew which preservation method suited each cut seal. Flippers dried differently than whale muscle. Walrus skin needed special treatment to avoid turning rubbery. Children were tasked with turning the meat regularly, their small hands perfect for adjusting hundreds of strips without knocking them off the racks. Celebration rituals served practical purposes, masked as revelry. Songs sung during the butchering weren't just entertainment. They paced the work, ensuring no one rushed and ruined good meat. Dances around the drying racks helped ward off scavengers by keeping constant movement near the food. Even the feasting itself had purpose, eating fresh liver first. Replenished hunters' vitamin A reserves depleted during long months of winter darkness. The community wasn't just celebrating. They were conducting nutritional maintenance disguised as partying. Hunt failures changed everything. No feast meant immediate rationing, half portions, bones boiled repeatedly for broth, families quietly trading favors for scraps. Elders would pretend they weren't hungry, slipping their shares to grandchildren. Hunters who returned empty-handed faced silent scrutiny rather than anger. Everyone knew the sea didn't owe them anything. Some villages kept emergency caches of aged meat buried in secret locations, though digging into these was an admission of collective failure nobody wanted to make. Distribution followed strict hierarchies disguised as traditions. The hunter who struck the killing blow got first pick of certain organs, considered potent heart for courage, eyes for sharp vision. His family received extra fat for their lamp because they'd host meetings to plan future hunts. Then came the tool makers who'd crafted the harpoons, followed by the women who prepared the kayak skins. By the time leftovers reached general distribution, every gram had been accounted for based on contribution and need. This wasn't socialism. It was sophisticated calorie accounting perfected over centuries. Preparation methods revealed resourcefulness. Whale skin fermented in seal oil became a delicacy that could last years. Intestines stuffed with fat and berries turned into vitamin-rich sausages. Even stomach contents weren't wasted partially. Digested kelp was skimmed off and dried as seasoning. The community's collective knowledge transformed raw kills into preserved nutrition that stretched far beyond the initial glut. Children learned these techniques by preparing miniature versions. With scraps their tiny hands, learning through repetition what words couldn't adequately explain. Feast attendance wasn't optional. Those who skipped without good reason found their shares diminished next time. Elders watched who showed up to help with butchering versus who only came to eat. Gossip flowed as freely as the food notes about. Who worked hardest, who shared willingly, whose family might need extra support. These gatherings functioned as communal audits where social standing was earned through participation as much as hunting skill. A kayak might bring food home, but keeping it required more than just paddling talent. The kayak's role extended beyond hunting. Successful returns meant spare materials for clothing repairs, extra oil for tool maintenance, bones for new. Harpoon tips. A single large kill could jumpstart the entire village's material economy. Sinew for threads, guts for waterproof containers, even vertebrae repurposed as stools. Nothing exemplified Arctic pragmatism better than watching a prized kayak transform from hunting platform to processing table to cargo vessel in a single afternoon as the village worked through the bounty. Spiritual aspects underlaid the practical ones. Certain cuts were reserved for ceremonies, tongues offered to spirits, flippers burned as thanks. Shamans might take specific organs for healing rituals, believing the whale's strength could transfer to patients. Even the kayak itself received offerings, rubs of fat along its frame, whispered thanks before being stowed. These practices weren't superstition so much as psychological maintenance for communities facing relentless environmental pressures. The feast nourished bodies. The rituals sustained wills. Children learned economics through leftovers. Extra meat went to families who shared during last lean period, not necessarily those with most status. Teens watched how certain hunters received preference, not for their skill, but because their elderly parents needed feeding. The system balanced contribution against need in ways that math couldn't quantify. A living lesson in communal survival, where the kayak was both tool and teacher. By adolescence, every village member could have explained the distribution rules as easily as their own name. Failed hunters still ate, but differently. They took less desirable cut-stuff muscle instead. Of tender fat, organs few wanted. Their families worked extra processing others' kills to earn shares. Pride suffered most. Nothing stung like watching your children eat from another hunter's bounty while your kayak sat empty. Yet even this had purpose: the public acknowledgement of failure, motivated without shaming, reminded without crushing. Next season's successful hunt would erase the debt, provided you didn't starve first. The kayak's ultimate value wasn't measured in meat, but in continuity. It fed bodies today while teaching children how to feed themselves tomorrow. Its presence meant another season of stories around oil lamps, another winter of full stomachs. Another year the village would endure. Modern freezer trucks can preserve food, but they'll never replicate that fragile Arctic moment when a hunter's skill met the community's need and both walked away satisfied. Now came the quiet part where full bellies let minds wander beyond survival to wonder about the kayak's other, less tangible gifts. Every kayak had a soul that was the first rule. Not in the way you think of a person having a soul, but something quieter, like how a well-worn tool seems to remember the hand that uses it. Hunters didn't just build kayaks. They woke them up. The process started with little rituals, whispering to the wood before cutting it, leaving scraps of meat near the skins as offerings. These weren't prayers exactly, more like polite reminders to the unseen world that they needed help. Not to drown. Shamans used kayaks like taxis to the spirit world. They'd paddle out alone at twilight, sometimes tying tiny carved figures to the bow that were supposed to guide them. The quiet glide of the kayak through still water was how they slipped between worlds, or so they claimed. Regular hunters didn't try this. Getting stuck in the spirit realm sounded worse than capsizing, but everyone knew a shaman's kayak was different. The charms woven into theirs weren't just for show. They were like spiritual bumpers against whatever lurked in the fog. Speaking of charms, every kayak had them. A bare tooth lashed near the bow to scare off angry seals. A raven feather tied where the hunter could see it for luck. Some builders tucked carved ivory figures into the frame, itself hidden like secrets. The best charms came from animals the hunter had killed himself, proof he respected what he hunted. These weren't decorations. They were early warning systems. A charm coming loose mid-hunt meant bad luck was coming, and no amount of pretending otherwise helped. Taboos surrounded kayaks like fences. Step over one? That's an insult to its spirit. Use it to haul trash? Prepare for terrible fishing. The rules varied by region, but everyone agreed breaking them invited disaster. One story told of a hunter who repaired his kayak with unblessed wood. Next trip out, a walrus punched through. The hull right where the new piece was? Coincidence? Maybe, but nobody risked finding out. Even how you stored a kayak mattered. Leave it upside down in summer? Fine. In winter? That's asking for ice demons to nibble holes in it. Messing up had consequences. Forget to make an offering before launching, and suddenly your paddle snaps at the worst moment. Use someone else's kayak without asking, and you might find it steers you straight into an iceberg. Some violations required public fixes, a whole ceremony where you apologized to the kayak in front of everyone. Others demanded quiet sacrifices, like tossing your best hunting knife into the sea to balance things out. The kayak's memory was long, and its patience shorter. The naming ritual wasn't just tradition. It was a handshake with the kayak's spirit. Names like Swift Between Waves or Never Flips weren't boasts. They were reminders of what the kayak could do if treated right. Say the name often enough, and the kayak might just live up to it. Forget the name, or worse, ridicule it, and you'd spend the next hunt fighting your own boat. Kids learned early. Teasing someone about their kayak's name was like poking a hornet's nest with your tongue. Building a kayak was half construction, half seance. Certain trees were avoided, ones that had been struck by lightning or grew too close to graves. Skins from sickly animals made kayaks with bad tempers. Even the knots in the sinew lashings had meaning. Tie them clockwise or risk angering the wind spirits. The whole process was less like carpentry and more like negotiating with the materials. Convince the wood it wanted to bend, persuade the skins they wanted to stretch. Force anything, and you'd regret it later. First launch ceremonies were mandatory. The shaman might sprinkle water on the bow, or the hunter would offer a bit of his own blood mixed with fat. Skipping this was like forgetting to fuel up a car. Your kayak might go, but not happily. Some hunters swore their kayaks paddled smoother after the rituals, as if some invisible weight had lifted. Others said it was nonsense, but still performed every step perfectly, just in case. Decorations weren't vanity, they were identification. Tags for spirits. Paint a certain stripe pattern, and the sea wolves would leave you alone. Carve a particular symbol, and fog might avoid you. These designs were family secrets, passed down like recipes. Get one wrong, and instead of repelling danger, you might attract it. One clumsy hunter painted his kayak with what he thought were protective runes. Turned out they were fertility symbols. He couldn't paddle near a seal colony without getting mobbed by amorous males. Breaking a kayak wasn't just losing a tool, it was losing a partner. Proper destruction rituals existed for kayaks too old to use. You didn't just burn them. You fed them carefully to the sea, bit by bit, so their spirit could join the others. Let a kayak rot on shore and its ghost might haunt the beach, tripping fishermen for generations. Some beaches were said to be littered with invisible angry kayaks, their splinters sharper than when they were whole. Respect wasn't optional. A well-treated kayak would warn its hunter of thin ice with faint creaks. It might ride waves better after being praised, or steer truer if the hunter shared food with it. This wasn't magic, it was the result of attention to detail. The hunter who noticed every splinter and loose stitch had a kayak that performed. Better, simple as that. The spiritual stuff just explained why care mattered beyond the obvious. Modern kayakers might laugh at all this, but they've got neoprene and GPS. Back then, when your survival depended on a frame of wood wrapped in skin, you paid attention to every whisper of tradition. Those rituals weren't just about spirits. They were about focus. Treat every step as sacred, and you're less likely to screw up the ones that keep you alive. The kayak's soul might have been imaginary, but the discipline it required was real enough to mean life or death. This knowledge didn't just sit in one person's head. It flowed through the whole community, passed down in stories and warnings. Lose that chain of teaching, and sooner or later, someone would forget why you shouldn't whistle while paddling, or what it meant when a charm cracked for no reason. The kayak remembered, but people had a habit of forgetting and forgetting. And the Arctic usually ended with someone becoming a cautionary tale. Learning to build a kayak wasn't about reading manuals. It was about listening until your ears ached. Master builders didn't write down measurements. They recited them in chants that wove numbers into stories. An apprentice's first job was usually just holding things, feeling the weight of wood and tools while the master narrated each step. The kid wouldn't touch a carving blade for months, but he'd know exactly how one should sound scraping against grain because the description got repeated daily. Hands-on training started with failures. Guilders would deliberately choose crooked wood for practice, making apprentices work out how to split it straight. First attempts looked like kindling, but that was the point better to ruin scrap wood and precious materials. Tools got passed down with warnings. This adze took 3 fingers off your uncle when he got cocky. Every mistake came with a story about someone who'd done worse, which was comforting until you realized those people usually died young. Memory tricks kept knowledge intact. Builders used body parts as measuring units, a forearm's length for this rib, 2 hand spans for that beam. They tied complex knots in sinew threads to mark proportions, unraveling them later while reciting measurements like poetry. Songs encoded construction sequences, with verses for lashing patterns and choruses about wood curing times. Forget a verse, and you might forget to leave enough flex in the kayak's hips. Testing was relentless. Masters would poke at half-finished frames, looking for weak spots. They'd make apprentices lash joints blindfolded or identify wood types by smell alone. One common test involved building a mini kayak 1/20th scale. Get those proportions right, and you might graduate to full size. Fail, and you'd spend another season processing seal hides while younger kids mocked your shaky stitching. Generational gaps caused problems. A grandparent might describe harvesting wood from forests that no longer existed, forcing adaptations no one had tried. Young builders added metal tools to old techniques, earning scowls from traditionalists who insisted bone blades worked fine. The smart ones listened anyway, because a master's grumbling often hid useful scraps of knowledge. This new iron knife cuts faster, an elder might mutter. Sure, if you want to lose a finger by lunchtime. Broken knowledge chains meant disaster. There's a story about a village where the last kayak builder died mid-lesson. The survivors tried completing his final kayak using half-remembered instructions. It floated long enough to reach deep water before the lashings gave way. After that, they traded for kayaks from rivals at 10 times the normal price until someone's teenage son reverse-engineered the designs by taking apart a wreck. Women held crucial knowledge, too. While men typically built kayaks, women prepared the skins through techniques just as complex. Girls learned to judge hide thickness by chewing tiny edges, to spot weak patches by how light shone through. There, mothers taught them which seals yielded the stretchiest skins, which stitching patterns lasted longest in icy water. Lose that knowledge, and even the finest frame became useless wrapped in leaky hides. Ceremonies reinforced learning. At each construction stage frame completion, skin stretching, waterproofing, there were rituals with specific words and actions. Forget the blessing before applying seal fat, and older builders would make you scrape it all off to start over. These weren't just spiritual acts. They were checkpoints ensuring nothing got missed. The rituals also weeded out lazy apprentices, no. One willing to sit through hours of chanting would half-ass their lashings later. Materials knowledge was oral encyclopedias. Elders could list every tree species within 5 days' travel, noting which ones bent well green versus dry. They knew sandy beaches where driftwood aged perfectly, cliffs where seabird droppings had strengthened exposed timber. This mental map took decades to build, and minutes to lose one severe storm could wipe out a key material site, forcing adaptations no one recalled clearly. Nonverbal teaching mattered. Masters would demonstrate a proper lashing without speaking, then gesture for the apprentice to try. Words came only after failure, often just a disappointed grunt. Some skills couldn't be explained anyway. You either felt when hides were stretched right, or you didn't. The best teachers used physical adjustments, moving a student's hands into position rather than describing angles. Disruptions shattered systems. When diseases brought by outsiders killed whole villages, surviving kayak builders found themselves teaching strangers. Without shared language or culture, they resorted to exaggerated demonstrations. Some carved instructional figures showing construction steps, the closest they came to manuals. These rarely captured nuances, like how much spit to use when splicing sinew, so the next generation's kayaks were always slightly worse. Aging masters faced dilemmas. Do you pass knowledge to the diligent apprentice who's mediocre, or the gifted one who's arrogant? Some chose neither, letting skills die rather than disrespect the craft. Others taught piecemeal, giving harpoon-making to one youth, frame-building to another, ensuring no single person held all the knowledge that had taken a lifetime to gather. It was risky, but so was entrusting everything to someone who might drown next season. The system worked until it didn't. For centuries, oral transmission kept kayak building alive through famines and wars. Then came ships bringing steel tools, then radios, then outboard motors. Suddenly, teenagers could learn carpentry from books or leave for jobs in towns. The chain stretched thin, then snapped in places. Today, a handful of elders still remember how to make kayaks the old way. They'll show you if you're willing to listen the way people did before words got written down. Now imagine those. Elders' faces when the first aluminum kayaks arrived, shiny factory-made shells that never needed greasing or blessings. The old ways were about to collide with a world that valued speed over tradition, convenience over craftsmanship. Some called it progress. Others watched their life's work become museum pieces before their eyes. The first aluminum kayak frames showed up like uninvited guests at a seal hunt shiny, lightweight, and completely missing the point. Traditional builders took one look at these metal skeletons and saw everything wrong with the modern world. No need to hunt for driftwood, no seasonal rituals for curing wood, just bolt some pipes together and call it a kayak? To elders who could identify different tree species by the sound of an adze striking them, this wasn't progress, it was amnesia with rivets. Early metal frames had practical advantages, though. They didn't warp in humidity or crack in extreme. Cold, you could mass-produce identical kayaks instead of painstakingly crafting each one. For communities losing their traditional material sources, forests receding, seal populations declining, metal offered a way to keep hunting. But something fundamental got lost in translation. A kayak that never needed blessings or understood. Taboos was like a sled dog that didn't know commands. It might function, but you couldn't trust it with your life. Resistance took subtle forms. Some hunters used metal frames, but still lashed them with sinew instead of bolts, as if the materials might negotiate a truce. Others added token charms to aluminum crossbeams, pretending the metal cared about tradition. A few outright refused to touch the new kayaks, even when their wooden ones became impossible to repair. There were stories of metal kayaks mysteriously developing leaks after elders whispered near them, though no one ever proved anything. Hybrid designs emerged from necessity. Builders stretched sealskins over aluminum frames, creating kayaks that looked traditional but weighed half as much. Some kept wooden ribs with metal keels, blending old and new like cultural camouflage. These compromises satisfied nobody completely. Purists said the kayaks had no soul. Modernists said they were just delaying the inevitable. But for hunters, caught between worlds, they worked well enough to keep food on the table while pretending they hadn't abandoned their ancestors entirely. The spiritual disconnect bothered people more than they admitted. You couldn't whisper to aluminum and expect it to listen. Metal didn't remember the hands that shaped it or the animals that died for it. Traditional kayaks carried history in every knothole and scar. Metal ones just existed. Some hunters reported feeling uneasy in metal kayaks during storms, as if the craft itself didn't care whether they survived. Others missed the way wooden frames creaked warnings when ice was near useful noises that aluminum never replicated. Manufacturers didn't help. They marketed metal kayaks as upgrades, implying traditional ones were primitive. Ads showed smiling hunters in factory-made kayaks, hauling absurd amounts of game, as if the metal itself magically improved aim. What the brochures didn't show, hunters struggling to repair cracked frames miles from help, or the way aluminum conducted cold straight to your knees. Traditional kayaks failed gradually, giving warnings. Metal ones often failed suddenly, like a trapdoor opening beneath you. Knowledge erosion accelerated. Why memorize 20 types of wood grain when one aluminum alloy did the job? Why spend years learning lashings that machines could replicate in minutes? Apprentices who might have trained for decades as kayak builders now took factory jobs instead. The chain of oral instruction, already fragile, started snapping in multiple places at once. Some elders refused to teach younger generations, resentful that their life's work was becoming obsolete. Others taught half-heartedly, knowing the students would probably switch to metal anyway. Oddly, metal kayaks created nostalgia for the old ways. Hunters who'd once complained about maintaining sealskins now missed the ritual of greasing them. Those who'd cursed fragile wooden frames found themselves reminiscing about how they'd flex with waves instead of fighting them. The very inconveniences that made traditional kayaks impractical now seemed like virtues, proof you were part of something older and wiser than convenience. This nostalgia wasn't enough to revive traditional building, but it kept the knowledge from disappearing completely. Practical problems emerged no one had anticipated. Metal frames conducted heat differently, making some traditional waterproofing techniques useless. The sharper edges wore through skins faster than rounded wood. And nothing prepared hunters. For the first time, they tried to repair an aluminum frame with traditional tools bone hammers versus metal rivets was a short, depressing battle. Many compromises were actually setbacks disguised as progress. The generational divide widened. Young hunters loved how quickly they could assemble metal kayaks after returning from wage jobs in towns. Elders saw this as impatience, a refusal to invest time in proper craftsmanship. Arguments erupted over whether real kayaks had to be made traditionally, or if that was just romanticizing hardship. Some families split along these lines, with different generations using completely different kayaks on the same hunts. You could track the rift just by looking at gear stacked near shorelines aging wooden frames beside gleaming metal ones, like artifacts from different timelines. Yet traditional kayaks never fully disappeared. There were always a few holdouts who kept building them, if only to prove it could still be done. Museums commissioned replicas, creating artificial demand for skills that had once been essential. Tourists paid premium prices for authentic kayaks they'd never risked taking on water. The knowledge survived, but its context changed from vital survival skill to cultural curiosity. Today, both versions coexist uneasily. You might see a hunter use a metal frame kayak for everyday fishing, but switch to a traditional one for important ceremonies. Some builders incorporate modern materials, discreetly synthetic sinew for lashings, epoxy sealants instead of seal fat, while maintaining the old forms. It's not purity, but it's not extinction either. The kayak's identity crisis never really ended. It just became part of its history, like everything else. What nobody anticipated was how metal kayaks would eventually validate traditional designs. Modern engineers analyzing ancient frames were stunned by their hydrodynamic efficiency. Turns out centuries of trial and error produced near-perfect shapes. Some aerospace companies even studied traditional lashing techniques for flexible joint applications. The old ways weren't obsolete, after all. They'd just been waiting for science to catch up. Now when builders teach apprentices, they often contrast both methods. See how this aluminum joint solves the cracking problem? But notice how it lacks the wood's natural flex. The lessons aren't about rejecting modernity or clinging to tradition, but understanding why each works. The kayak hasn't been replaced. It's evolved like it always has. Just this time, the adaptation wasn't to ice or seals, but to the modern world itself. The real test came when traditional kayaks started outperforming metal ones in unexpected ways. Their quieter movement scared fewer seals. Their lighter weight made portages easier. Most importantly, they could be repaired anywhere with materials at hand. No need to wait for factory parts. Slowly, without fanfare, some hunters began returning to traditional builds, not out of nostalgia, but practicality. The circle wasn't unbroken, but it wasn't finished either. What's left now is choice. Hunters can paddle mass-produced metal, or spend months crafting tradition. Some do both, using each kayak for what it does best. The conflict between old and new hasn't resolved so much as faded into background noise. One more variable in the endless calculation of survival. Kayak adapted, just like the people who relied on it. And adaptation, after all, was always the point. The last builders of traditional kayaks work in quiet places, tiny workshops near Arctic shores, where the smell of salt mixes with fresh wood shavings. These elders hold knowledge that took entire lifetimes to learn and centuries to perfect. You'll find them splitting driftwood with practiced swings, their hands moving through steps they can't fully explain because it's as natural as breathing. Ask why they use a certain knot or wood type, and they'll shrug. It works. That's the extent of their manuals. These masters aren't just builders, they're walking libraries. One might know a specific spruce stand where trees grow just the right curve for bow pieces. Another remembers a bay where sealskin stretches perfectly if harvested during spring. Tides. Their knowledge exists nowhere in books, only in the creases of their hands and the stories they tell while working. When they pass, entire chapters of technique vanish mid-sentence. Even now, some builders in their 80s rush to teach what they can, aware they're racing against something far less forgiving than Arctic weather. Modern life makes terrible apprentices. The few young people learning the craft have to juggle jobs, school, and the siren call of easier careers. Traditional kayak building doesn't pay well when factory-made plastic ones cost a fraction of the price. The apprenticeship hasn't gotten any shorter either. You still need years just to learn the basics. Why spend a month carving ribs when you could buy aluminum ones online? This math makes sense until you realize you're not just losing boats, but an entire way of seeing the world. Revival programs try to bridge the gap. Museums commission kayaks just to keep builders working. Cultural centers host workshops where tourists pay to watch a master's hands transform wood and skin. Smart elders have started slipping lessons into these events, showing how to select wood while cameras click, sneaking in lashing techniques between translator-assisted interviews. It's not the old way of teaching, but it keeps the knowledge moving. Some builders say they've taught more in 10 workshops than they did in 30 years of waiting for hometown apprentices. The transmission feels fragile. You'll see an elder guiding a novice's hands around a knife, adjusting fingers with a patience that borders on heartbreaking. Every lesson has this quiet urgency, like passing a baton in a race where the next runner might drop it. Some try recording the steps, but video misses the tactile details, the exact pressure needed when bending wood, the moment soaked skins are ready for stretching. These subtleties die in pixels. Materials themselves are conspiring against the tradition. Driftwood patterns have changed with shifting currents. Seal populations aren't what they were. Builders now improvise with what's available, substituting materials in ways that would have made their teachers scowl. A kayak made from store-bought lumber and synthetic cordage isn't the same, but it's something. Maybe enough to keep the idea alive until better materials return. Oddly, the kayaks themselves remember more than people do. Examining old kayaks in museums, builders spot solutions to problems nobody knew how to solve anymore. The curve of a rib here, the lashing pattern there, the answers were in plain sight, left behind by those who assumed future generations would still care. Some revivalists have become detectives, reverse engineering techniques from kayaks made before their grandparents were born. Tourism creates awkward allies. Wealthy adventurers will pay startling sums for authentic kayaks they'll hang in ski chalets. Builders take the money, even as they resent the kayaks never touching water. But that cash funds apprenticeships and buys materials for functional builds. One elder put it bluntly, let them have their wall decorations. Their money builds real kayaks for real hunters. A cynical trade, but survival often is. Communities wrestle with the living museum paradox. Traditional kayak events draw crowds, but few attendees grasp what they're seeing. Spectators applaud launching ceremonies that aren't performances but necessary blessings. Builders play along, smiling for photos while whispering the actual prayers under their breath. The line between preservation and parody thins yearly. Apprentices face identity whiplash. They might spend mornings studying traditional stitching and evenings scrolling through TikTok. Some try blending world-streaming builds online, using hashtags where their teachers use chants. The old masters tolerate this, reasoning that attention, even misguided, beats oblivion. One teen documented his entire apprenticeship on Instagram. His grandfather didn't understand likes, but noticed the boy's stitches improving. The economics remain brutal. A proper traditional kayak costs thousands in materials and months of labor. Hunters who could benefit most can't afford them, and rich buyers want display pieces, not working vessels. Some builders have turned to making miniatures perfectly scaled kayaks that teach techniques without the crippling costs. Others run build-your-own camps, where fees from hobbyists subsidize traditional apprentices. Stubbornness might be the craft's best hope. The remaining builders share a quiet refusal to let this be the generation that drops the thread. You'll find them in their 70s, splitting wood that could outlive them, nagging teenagers to pay attention. Their workshops are shrines to patients' half-finished kayaks collecting dust between lessons. Tools hung in perfect rows waiting for hands that may never come. They've accepted they might be the last, but they'll pretend otherwise until the end. The kayaks themselves adapt better than people. Modern builds incorporate synthetic sinew for lashings, epoxy sealants instead of seal fat. Purists grumble, but pragmatists note the frames still bend correctly, the skins still shed waves. Perhaps tradition isn't about freezing time, but steering inevitable change. A kayak lashed with nylon still carries the shape of its ancestors, still whispers the old ways to whoever leans close enough to hear. Their legacy extends in ways they'll never see. Marine engineers now study traditional hull designs for wind-powered freighters. Biologists analyze lashing patterns for tendon repair. Techniques. That thing your great-grandfather did with whalebone and gut? Turns out it's a near-perfect solution for underwater robotics joints. The kayak's genius was never just about hunting. It was about solving problems with whatever materials lay at hand. That lesson travels well, even if the builders never leave their villages. So the last builders work on, measuring time in kayaks completed rather than years past. Somewhere, a 14-year-old watches, not yet realizing his hands will need to remember what his eyes are seeing. Somewhere a strip of wood bends just right, carrying the curve of centuries into whatever comes next. The line is thin, but unbroken. The kayak's journey from Arctic survival tool to suburban recreation item is one of history's quieter ironies. That thing designed to sneak up on seals in freezing waters now bobs behind vacation homes in Florida. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took decades of commercialization, design tweaks, and a fundamental shift in why people wanted to sit in floating coffins in the first place. Early attempts to sell kayaks outside the Arctic flopped. Nobody in 1920s Europe needed a skin boat to hunt whales. But entrepreneurs noticed something the sleek design turned heads at boat shows. So they started marketing them as Eskimo canoes, emphasizing exoticism over function. The first recreational models were just slightly modified hunting kayaks, which meant they tipped easily and soaked anyone who didn't have years of balance training. Sales were not great. Plastic changed everything. Once manufacturers could injection mold kayaks by the thousands, prices plummeted. Suddenly, you could buy something vaguely kayak-shaped for less than a good bicycle. The design simplified two wider hulls for stability, sealed cockpits to keep office workers dry. None of these features helped hunt seals, but they made kayaks perfect for floating down lazy rivers with a cooler of beer. The original purpose faded until it was just a fun fact on packaging. Materials kept evolving. Fiberglass replaced wood, then polyethylene replaced fiberglass. Each change made kayaks cheaper and more durable, but also heavier and clumsier. Traditional builders would have wept seeing their graceful designs rendered in garish plastic, complete with cup holders. But the trade-off worked. By the 1990s. You could find kayaks at Walmart next to inflatable pools. The ultimate survival craft had become a backyard toy. Cultural disconnect grew with each adaptation. Recreational kayakers didn't need to know how to roll. They had life jackets. Nobody cared about silent paddling when you were just circling a lake. The spiritual connection between hunter and craft got reduced to a logo on the side. Some manufacturers tried honoring traditions with authentic designs, but these were usually just regular kayaks with Inuit-style patterns slapped on. The soul of the thing got lost in translation. Something unexpected happened, though. The kayak's DNA proved stubborn. Those ancient hull shapes, refined over centuries, turned out to be near perfect for modern water sports. Whitewater kayaks borrowed the original's ability to ride waves. Sea kayaks kept the long, efficient glide. Even fishing kayaks used the same basic principles of stability and maneuverability. The old ways hadn't disappeared. They just put on new clothes. The sporting world embraced kayaking with competitive enthusiasm. Olympic events demanded precision rolls and rapid sprint skills that would have made any Arctic hunter nod in approval. Marathon paddlers covered distances that rivaled traditional hunting routes. The context changed, but the core challenge remained: human versus water, with only a thin shell between them. Somewhere along the way, recreation became its own kind of survival test. Ironically, commercialization saved traditional designs. As mass-produced kayaks flooded the market, a counter-movement emerged. Purists sought out hand-built skin-on frame kayaks, willing to pay thousands for authenticity. Workshops teaching traditional techniques found unexpected demand from city dwellers craving connection to older ways. The kayak's commodification created the very nostalgia that now fuels its preservation. Military and rescue teams rediscovered what hunters always knew: nothing beats a good kayak for stealthy water access. Special forces use folding kayaks, based on ancient designs, to approach targets silently. Coast guards keep them for shallow water rescues where motorboats can't go. The wheel turned full circle, cutting-edge technology imitating prehistoric ingenuity, because sometimes old solutions are still the best ones. Environmentalists latched onto kayaks as symbols of low-impact travel. No engine noise to scare wildlife, no fuel spills to pollute water. Paddlers could get closer to animals than any motorized craft allowed a twist on the original hunting purpose. That seal you're photographing instead of harpooning? Your kayak's ancestor helped put its great-great-grandfather on a dinner plate. The kayak's adaptability became its greatest strength. It morphed from survival tool to sport to lifestyle accessory without losing its essential character. You can now buy transparent kayaks for Instagram photos, fishing kayaks with pedal drives, even solar-powered electric ones. Through all these changes, the basic idea persists: a human-powered boat that moves efficiently through water. The Arctic hunters would recognize that much, even if the neon colors baffled them. What got lost was the intimacy of creation. Buying a plastic kayak off a rack requires no understanding of materials or construction. You don't know which tree species works best for ribs, or how to test hide thickness by chewing. The transfer of knowledge from builder to user happens through an instruction manual now, not years of apprenticeship. Convenience came at the cost of that deep, hard-won understanding, yet the kayak spirit lingers in unexpected places. Surfers talk about reading waves the way hunters once read ice conditions. Whitewater paddlers developed that same instinctive balance needed to survive Arctic rolls. The connection between human and craft still matters, even if it's for fun rather than survival. Maybe that's the kayak's real legacy, proving that some relationships transcend their original purpose. The global spread created odd hybrids. Korean fishermen use brightly colored plastic kayaks based on centuries-old designs. Norwegian scientists paddle replicas while studying climate change. Australian tour guides lead groups in boats that would look familiar to someone from 1800s Greenland. The kayak became a global citizen, adapting to each new home while carrying traces of its origins. In the end, the kayak's second life makes sense. It was always about solving problems with whatever materials were at hand. If the modern problem's how to enjoy nature without wrecking it, or how to find adventure in a safe package, the kayak adapts accordingly. The original builders might laugh at our leisure pursuits, but they'd understand the impulse to take something simple and make it work for your needs. Which brings us to tonight's final thought. That thing in your garage or at the rental dock? It's got more history than you probably realized. Every time you paddle, you're borrowing skills perfected by people who needed them to survive. The water hasn't changed, even if our reasons for being on it have. So next time you're out there, take a moment to appreciate the quiet genius floating beneath you. Designed so good, it outlived its original purpose without breaking stride. That wooden frame wrapped in sealskin kept generations alive. Now it's the same shape in neon plastic at your local sporting goods store. The kayak's journey from hunting necessity to weekend hobby proves good design outlives its original purpose. Makes you wonder what everyday objects around us right now will have equally surprising second lives. Maybe your smartphone becomes some future archaeologist's fishing weight, or that electric car battery ends up powering ceremonial lights in 2524. Before you click away, drop a comment. What piece of modern craftsmanship deserves to survive like the kayak did? And if you enjoyed this sleepy history lesson, that subscribe button won't press itself.